Official. Hello, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you for your grace while we try to sort out how to make the space as accessible as possible. I have a mentor who likes to say that there are some values that don't always play well together, and two of them are inclusion and efficiency, that sometimes we need to move a little bit more slowly if we want to be inclusive. I would argue that it's not that inclusion is less efficient. It's just, it's a timing thing, right? Like in the short term, it feels like it moves more slowly, but in the long run, I think we get where we want to go faster because we brought everyone along with us. So thank you so much for your patience and your grace. I have a flexible day today. I'm happy to go over our original planned time if it feels like there's a need for that, but I also want to honor everyone else's time. I know that I bet everyone is very, very busy and 1 o'clock is going to get here and you've got other stuff to do. So maybe that's a good place to start, actually. When I am invited into spaces like these, I like to offer a couple of invitations. The first one being, I invite you to do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable today. Eat, drink, take breaks, move your body, go on camera, off camera, yell, whatever you need to do to feel comfortable as we have this conversation. Please, please know that I invite you to do that. I only have 3 invitations. My next invitation is I invite us all to practice radical belief. As we share our stories with each other today, folks might share experiences that feel so different from your own that you wonder if they could even be possible. We are going to challenge ourselves to believe every single thing that we hear wholeheartedly. We can hold the space. We can make a space big enough, deep enough, strong enough, flexible enough to hold all of our truth. So I invite us all to work on that. And then the last one, if I were to say I had any rules, it would be this one. It's confidentiality. So if maybe in a breakout session, someone shares a personal story, we ask that those stories be left behind when you go home today. So they're on loan to us as learning tools, but they don't become our property. So we will not repeat each other's stories, repeat each other's words outside of this space. Absolutely take the lessons with you. There's going to be a recording, of course, so notice that in terms of what you share and when you share it. And also know that we're not going to take each other's words and share those stories outside of this learning opportunity that we have today. And then my business partner and I like to start with a couple of different things. First of all, the big one is that we like to be really thoughtful about transparency and orienting everyone to what we're doing and where we're coming from. And we do that by breaking transparency down into a series of words that start with the letter P, because it helps us remember them. So the first one is personal. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and how I got here, so you know some more about the perspective that I bring to this conversation and this kind of work. My name is Adana Protonentis. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a mom of 2 kids, both of whom have psychiatric disabilities and developmental disabilities. I myself have a disability. I identify as a Black mixed-raced woman. I live in what's now called SeaTac, which is on the land of the Suquamish, the Duwamish, and the Muckleshoot. I also invite you all to share the Indigenous names of the lands where you live in the chat. And also, if there are any calls to action around supporting our Indigenous leaders, if there are business owners from Indigenous communities that you know of that we could be supporting, if there are leaders of community organizations that are doing work that you would like to amplify in the chat today, that would be really wonderful. I would love to learn some more and share resources with each other about what's happening in our Native communities around the state of Washington. I started doing this kind of work a few years ago, probably it's been almost 10 years now, largely because I found myself in this this conundrum, this challenging spot really often, where I would be doing racial justice work and finding myself really frustrated that no one wanted to talk about disability. And then I'd be doing disability justice work and finding myself really frustrated that nobody wanted to talk about race. And bouncing back and forth and going, why aren't we talking to each other more? Because the truth is, my kid doesn't stop being Black just because we're talking about his autism today. He's both all the same time, right? I don't stop being Black just because we're talking about disability today. I don't stop being disabled because we're talking about the fact that I'm a woman or that I'm a Black person. All of those things exist at once. And yet I found it really difficult to find spaces that would welcome that kind of nuance. And that squeezes a lot of people out. And so I've made that my work, trying to support us in developing more flexible, nuanced spaces so that when we get together as a community and we say nothing about us without us, we have a really clear sense of who we mean when we say us. And that if we're going to claim all of us as members, that we're truly representing each other fully and not asking people to show up just as parts of themselves. So that's the personal piece. And that gets into the purpose of today, which is that's the second P, purpose, to deepen our understanding of the diversity in our community, talk about these intersections of identity that we find ourselves grappling with, all with the goal of developing a deeper sense of care and belonging for everyone within our community so that we can really show up for each other and take good care of each other. Process, I'm a very informal person. Please don't feel like you have to wait for a special question and answer session at some point in the workshop. If questions come up for you along the way, I invite them in whatever format feels most comfortable for you. If you would prefer to send them by chat, if you would prefer to come off mute, if you want to send them to me as a private message in the chat and have me read it without using your name so that you can have some privacy, I'd be happy to do that too. Whatever is going to feel most supportive in your learning and your engagement. And then the last one is power, which is something that I don't feel like we talk about enough. So I'm trying to do that more and more. My role today, especially as a facilitator, is to equalize power. We all come to this space with different kinds of power that we hold in different areas of our lives. Some of us might have power that comes with the position we hold with our job. Some of us might have power with a position we hold in our community. Some of us might have less power because of the position we hold in our community. Some of us might have power because we're a citizen versus an immigrant. Some of us might have power because of our age. There's lots of different ways that power gets attached to us, lots of different ways we can wield it. And my job is to be thoughtful about the fact that we're all coming from those different places with different levels of power, and that we want to try to even that out so that we can all feel like we've got equitable access to power in this space. So I'm going to notice, for example, things like there's a lot of power in being an extrovert. Being someone like me who feels really comfortable talking a lot in front of big groups of people, it's really easy for me to get access to a microphone and take up a lot of space. That is disempowering maybe to people who are introverts. So one of my jobs as a facilitator is to notice that and notice if there are folks who are not speaking up very often, that I try to make sure that they have the opportunity to do so if they would like to. That's really it in terms of the P's. I'm just going to check on the chat really quickly. Yes, power can absolutely come with level of education and the type of education, for sure. I love these introductions that I'm seeing in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing where you're coming from and just a little bit about your title and your context. That's so helpful. So I'm just going to dive in head first. We have this question about who is us, and that feels kind of like a strange question to ask because surely we know who we are. And yet, when you consider some of the unique features of disability and of the disability community, it makes a lot of sense that we would need to pretty regularly pause and check in about who we are and how we're tending to each other and taking care of each other. Disability is so vast and it's so fluid. It includes a very wide range of people. Onset of disability can happen at any time. So your relationship to disability can change and often does change many times over the course of your life. Also, our relationship to disability as part of our identity can change over time, and we often see it evolve over time. We see that in the way that people use language. Sometimes folks make some shifts from using language like special needs or differently abled, which is a little euphemistic and creates a little bit of distance, to using language that is more direct and saying things like person with a disability or disabled person. Sometimes people move from using identity first language to person first language, or from person first language to identity first language. All of those are indications that as we live and experience the world, our relationship to disability, our understanding of disability often evolves. And if that's true for us as individuals, it's also very true for our entire community. An example that comes to mind is COVID. We have a lot of new members of the disability community after COVID. Not that COVID's over, because it isn't, but I think some of us are pretending that it is. For example, there's now a new medical condition called long COVID, and people with long COVID are entitled to legal protection under the Americans with Disabilities Act. They are new disabled people, new members of our community. There are people who have all kinds of other long-term impacts from having experienced COVID or some of the other impacts of lockdown, whether that's some psychiatric impairments or impacts on their heart or their lungs. There's lots of different ways that COVID changed a lot of things for a lot of people. And so that kind of shifts what our community looks like and makes me kind of want to pause and wonder if this is a good time to check in about who we are as a community of people and what our needs might be, how our needs might be evolving as our population evolves. We really need a lot of nuance when we talk about our community. And that's really hard. Or I guess like the need for that nuance becomes really clear to me in times of crisis, particularly when I hear our community talked about in ways that are oversimplified and very reductive. So like in early pandemic days, when there were a lot of narratives of you only have to worry about COVID if you are an elder or you're disabled. Like they're just huge blanket statement that doesn't honor the diversity of our community. It doesn't honor who within our community of people with disabilities might be more or less likely to be at risk of COVID or risk of long-term impacts from COVID. There's just so much to who we are. It's a really complex and dynamic group of people. And that makes it both very tricky to do really effective organizing around legislative action and laws and all the protections that we need. And it opens a lot of access points that may not exist for other communities because we are so complex and nuanced, because there's so much diversity here. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more, but first I want to ground us in some definitions, largely because some of it's because of the work that I do, but I hear the words diversity, equity, and inclusion like 1,000 times a day. And and then it gets shortened to the acronym, it's just DEI. And these words don't get separated out, and they have distinct meanings, and they're really important. And disability is a very important part of diversity. So I think it's important to pause and define some of these terms. So first, diversity is honestly just a numerical representation of difference. That's all it is. There's not actually any value attached to it. It's all about how the diversity shows up and how the diversity gets to interact with what's around it. So you could have a diversity of types of pencils. You could have a diversity of elephants. You could have a diversity of children. You can have all different kinds of diversity. That's not necessarily an indication of inclusion, just because diversity is present. So can anybody think of an example of a time that you noticed, or an example that you've seen of an environment that was diverse, but not necessarily inclusive? Yeah, go for it, Kim.
Like a meeting like this where there wasn't interpreters for the deaf or Spanish speaking.
Yes, great example. Darla, I saw a big nod from you. Did you have an example that came to mind? Oh, I can't hear you. I also think about places like prisons, super diverse. I'm not sure I would call that an inclusive space, certainly not an equitable space. It's very, and I see sometimes in organizations too, where on paper, like on the numbers, they can say we're very diverse. We have, 30% of our employees are people of color, or 40% of our employees are people with disabilities. But then if I look and see what kind of power those people hold, what positions they're in, what kind of money they get paid, I'm not really seeing signs of inclusion. I'm certainly not seeing signs of equity. So inclusion then would be a little bit different, right? Inclusion is about being able to participate fully in the space, that you're not just there as a token, that you actually get to be part of every single thing that's happening to the degree that you want to. I think that choice component is very important. And then equity is distinct because of power. I think a lot of us have seen that, that picture of like the kids that are trying to watch a baseball game and they're standing on some wooden boxes, and they show you equality, which is everybody gets one box, whether or not they need it. And then equity is everybody gets the size or the number of boxes that they need to see over the fence. And I always wondered about how power comes into play there. Who decides who gets how many boxes? Who controls the boxes? Who decides that they're even watching baseball? Maybe they want to watch soccer. I don't know. Why is it a wooden fence? Why can't it be a chain link fence? To me, when we add together diversity and inclusion and equity, we have a group of people who have lots of different types of identities represented, who can participate fully, who have power to shape the outcome of what happens. I think that's the big difference. So I got so excited talking that I completely forgot to pull up my slides. I'm going to do that now. I'm going to do it again with sound because I have a video clip later. There we go. Come on. Excellent. We've done all that. So another term to define, maybe this is probably not necessary with this group of humans, but again, just so we're all using language the same way, how do we define disability? It's so broad, right? It's so vast. It can include everything from kids in Flint, Michigan, who have need for special education services because of lead in the drinking water, to my dad, who was disabled in the Vietnam War, to my mom, who has spinal stenosis and really bad arthritis, to my brother who has ADHD, right? Like that's a huge range of people who experience disability in very, very different ways, and yet they get attached to the same label. It's part of why it can be so challenging to really tend to all of our needs, and why it can be so tempting to try to group folks within that label. So the legal definition of disability, I'm just pulling from the Americans with Disabilities Act, says that a disability is any impairment, cognitive, psychological, or physical, that impacts activities of daily living. That's super broad. That's really, really vast. And I think it's also interesting that it doesn't specifically call out the need for a diagnosis. It's really about the impact that it's having on your life, which makes it, I think, a more accessible way of thinking about impairment and thinking about disability too. So pretty lovely definition in a lot of ways. When I think about, again, like who is us, we're a huge community of people. 26% of adults in the United States, that's 61 million people, have a disability of some kind. 1 in 5 women in the world have some type of disability. About 1 in 5 adults in the United States have some type of disability, and in the Black community, it's 1 in 4. And there's a very strong relationship between disability and poverty. A little bit later, we're going to talk about this phrase that I hear sometimes, that disability is both a cause and a consequence of poverty. I think it's going to be helpful to unpack that. But before we get there, I also wanted to talk a little bit about, if we're going to talk about disability, we should talk about ableism, right? The type of oppression that disabled people experience in the world. I really love this definition of ableism. This is by someone named T.L. Lewis. And one of the things that I really love about this is that every year, T.L. Lewis comes back and refines the definition and updates it. So it's this very organic kind of living things. I'll read it really quickly. They describe ableism as a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. It's a lot of big words. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. Anything come up for you when you hear that definition? Does it resonate? Does it feel incomplete? Feel free to jump off mute if you would like to share any reflections or insights. Sandy.
Thank you, Adana. I've had this conversation with several people before because I did study accessibility studies and disability law and things like that. And I feel like sometimes ableism creeps into our own disability support system. So the idea that a person should strive to be productive, or a person should strive to function and appear as normal as possible. And I think oftentimes that really sneaks in and undermines the idea that there are disabilities and there are things that people are unable to do, yet we value people even in our support systems when they function better, or they improve on things, or they get employment and they're able to live on their own. So it is very interesting to me how ableism is present in our own conversations about disability supports.
Oof. Yes, that was amazing. It is really interesting, those, just as you're saying, those definitions of progress as being attached to what you're producing and how quickly you produce it. I think a lot about pace when it comes to the way we measure a person's, I don't know, like the quality of their contributions, perhaps. There's this attitude that I bump into in academia with professors who think it's somehow more academically rigorous if they give you less time to complete an assignment, as if that's going to mean that you're getting higher quality work. That's not how that works, right? Like you're not going to get a deeper analysis out of me by making me do it in 5 hours instead of 5 days. You're not going to get some like richer insight by making us do it faster. And yet it seemed it's framed in terms of being better somehow, or proof of excellence if you can do something really fast. And that's something that I've learned a lot from my experience with disability, is that I really have to be thoughtful about pace. I have to be thoughtful about capacity. I have to make some very intentional choices about how much I can take on and how quickly I can do it. My business partner is a big fan of saying, we move at the pace of us. And I think that that's such a beautiful phrase, and something that reminds me of one of my favorite things about disability community is this desire to tend to each other's ideal pace rather than just steamrolling ahead and assuming that faster is better. And Sandy, I think you just raised such a great insight about an area we could be more thoughtful and intentional about, where some of those ableist attitudes can be creeping in. I also notice a lot of intersections in this definition. The next word we're going to talk about is intersectionality, but before we get there, T.L. Lewis talks about anti-Blackness, they talk about colonialism, they talk about imperialism. A lot of that has to do with identity, different kinds of identity, whether it's someone's race or country of origin or religion. I think we could even add in here. There's lots of ways that our experience of disability can be magnified or even just shifted, and whether for better or worse, just feel different because of the other identities that we hold. We already talked about that. So intersectionality, which is kind of the heart of why we're gathering today. Intersectionality is a word that was created or coined, or I don't know what the right term is, by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1988. And she was trying to find a way to talk about the unique experience, the unique harm that people are exposed to when you live at the intersection of two forms of oppression. And the example that she was using was race and gender. So she is an attorney. She teaches at Harvard Law School. And she'd read about a case from Michigan where a Black woman was trying to get a job working at an automobile plant, and they wouldn't hire her. And the reason they wouldn't hire her is that they would only hire women to work in secretarial positions. You could come and you could do admin work, you could do paperwork, you could type, but you weren't allowed on the factory floor as a woman. Only men were allowed on the factory floor. They would only hire Black men to work on the factory floor. They would only hire white women to work in the office. If you're a Black woman, where do you go? There's nowhere to go. So this woman filed a lawsuit and said that they were discriminating against her on the basis of her race and on the basis of her gender. And she lost the lawsuit. The judge said, you can't say that they discriminate based on race because they hire Black people, they hire Black men. And you can't say they're discriminating based on gender because they hire women, they hire white women. You're stuck. There's no legal remedy. You're just stuck. And so that was the story behind this term intersectionality. It helped us have some language to talk about that experience. I imagine there are lots of examples of times that maybe, I think about girls and autism, for example, how difficult it can be for girls and femmes on the autism spectrum to get identified and diagnosed. They get missed. Their behavior is described or explained in a lot of other ways. And my own daughter just got an autism diagnosis at the age of 10. My son got his diagnosis when he was 3. And I think some of that was about what we've been taught to look for. It was really difficult to find the right kind of support for Aurelia, who's standing at that intersection of being a girl and being autistic. I think that there's probably lots of ways that these intersections come to mind. I'd love to hear from you all about any that jump out at you. Or even maybe experiences you've had where you felt that you were being judged based on one part of your identity, but not another.
The chat is pretty active right now. It says, let's see, try working as a tech firm or in a tech firm as a woman.
Yeah.
I just wonder where I could be if I'd had 15 years of support.
Sorry, that's a follow-up to my previous comment about I have ADHD and I got my diagnosis at the age of 25. And my male partner has known he's had ADHD since he was 10 or younger. I'm not quite sure. So if I'd gotten diagnosed at 10, where would I be right now? I'm curious. I don't know. I'll never know.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think there's also some power to be found in using a very simple little graphic like this one to think about all of the identities that we hold and how many different parts of ourselves are existing at any time. And these are just a few, but there are many, many more we could add. Parent status, for example, immigration status, we could just keep going and going. And one of the things that I noticed is that there are areas that I hold a lot of privilege, and there are areas that I absolutely do not have privilege, areas that I experience oppression. And I think it's important for me to remember those. And it's also important for me to notice the tendency that sometimes I might have to lean into the areas where I'm the underdog, the areas where I feel oppression, and not have the same level of ownership of my privilege. So maybe I should define privilege, but first I see Brenda's got her hand up, so I was going to pause.
Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt that, but
No worries.
it just brought to mind the day I realized my son is an adult with a developmental disability, and the day that I realized that there is actually a hierarchy in disability land as well.
Mm.
And how, frankly, it was hurtful to me because he's maybe not on the top, maybe not on the bottom, but, and just that I had this illusion that he, oh, you would just be accepted as a person with a disability in the disability world, when actually even in the disability world, there were categories and hierarchy. And anyway, I guess that was just more of an observation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You're so right. There's so much nuance there that even within, I think about that in my community, in the Black community, for example, I experience harm from racism, but I benefit from colorism because I'm light skinned. There's definitely a hierarchy within the community about like even if you look at like Hollywood and see who the big name actors are, it's usually lighter skinned people have more power and prestige and access than darker skinned people do, even if racially we're the same group of people. It's really messy and complicated. I wanted to unpack the word privilege because I know it can be just kind of a tender term at times, and I feel like it gets thrown around too casually. So when I talk about privilege, in general, what I mean is the experience of, it's not that I get extra bonus points or I get extra special stuff with my privilege. It's about what I don't have to deal with. It's the barriers that I don't encounter. So I just turned 40. The age of 40 is a pretty pleasant age, I think, in this country. I'm not old enough that I have people condescending to me. I'm not feeling sidelined because of my age being too old. I'm not feeling disempowered because I'm too young, right? I can vote, I could drink, I can drive, I can do, not at the same time. I can do all of those things, right? So I've got a lot of privilege. I have a lot of access and I'm not encountering a lot of barriers. Someone my mom's age, my mom is 77, she encounters barriers constantly because of her age. And it's, like I was saying, not that I'm getting something special, it's about what I'm not having to put up with. We can think of gender similarly. My husband, there are a lot of barriers he does not experience as a cisgender man. He's 6'2", he's broad-shouldered, he's a white guy. The world is his oyster. He's doing just fine. He doesn't have to worry about taking the car to the shop and being talked to like he doesn't understand how cars work, or he doesn't have to worry about walking down the street and feeling unsafe, maybe in some of the ways that I do. There's just a lot of barriers that I encounter that he doesn't encounter. And I think that with every one of these parts of identity that are on this screen right here, we could probably think of barriers that people might encounter if they have a lower level of education, for example, versus barriers that aren't removed for you if you have a higher level of education. If we think about sexuality, age, gender, we could go on and on and on. So that's how I think about privilege. It's about the bad stuff you don't have to encounter. Wanted to show you this really quickly about intersectionality, especially as it relates to race and disability. This is from the Ford Foundation, and this is a really wonderful activist named Carrie Gray.
My name is Carrie Gray. Carrie Gray is a Black disabled woman, and there's power behind that. In the United States, 1 in 4 in the Black community have some type of disability, whether that's visible or invisible. Historically speaking, organizations and institutions have shown us that they want to identify with one thing and build power around that, build influence and access. And I get it, right? So this idea that you have disability rights, you have women's rights, you have LGBTQ rights, and those kind of different pockets are really building a strong narrative. But the thing that I find to be harmful is when we're not building in coalition. Because the reality is that you have people like myself who are Black, disabled, and women, and so many other things. And when you live at the intersections of all three of those, then you can't split your political and social dynamics between these different groups. It doesn't produce real results of freedom, and it doesn't produce real results of access to employment and other opportunities that you're looking for. I'll give one example on this. So the Black Lives Matter movement. When it was created in conjunction mostly with a lot of young folks. What was unique about this particular movement was the intersectional philosophy that was built upon. The folks getting up and saying, we are not just fighting for one narrative, but we are specifically fighting for folks who are on the margins. We are fighting for Black folks who are also LGBTQ, who are women, who are femme, who are trans, who are disabled. They named it. They saw like their people across the country and said, I'm fighting for all of you. Not just some of you, not just the ones that have traditionally gained power and access. And that gives me a lot of hope because no one wants to be left behind.
What do you think? What comes up for you?
So this is Darla. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay. Okay. I loved her strength and her ownership and her power that she put forth.
Mhm.
I thought she did a really good job in describing the intersectionality of all of it. But what really stood out to me was the power that she declared in the room.
Absolutely. Hey, Trish.
Hi.
Hi.
In that video, it occurs to me that when we talk about disability, like inclusion is one of our core values, right? Like that's a big deal for us to strive for, to identify that that's our goal, that's what we want to have. And to celebrate when that's happening and when we're doing a good job of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it occurs to me that, we haven't been explicit about what that means, right? We talk about it explicitly like in disability, but when we're talking about people with these intersectional identities, I don't think we've done a very good job of being explicit. So that's just kind of some of the things that are going through my mind as I watch that.
I love that you said that. Sometimes I have conversations in my consulting practice where folks might say, we want our programs to be accessible to all, or we want like I worked with the Downtown Seattle Association, and they were talking about how they wanted a clean, safe, fun downtown for all. And I kept asking them, what does all mean? And they're like, all. And they were hesitant to name specific groups of people out of fear of leaving someone out. They were worried that if they start saying elders and veterans and people of color, and if they started getting that granular, that they would forget someone and they would accidentally exclude. But also by using a blanket all, it made it hard to meaningfully include. It made it hard to make plans to include each of those groups of people because they hadn't been named. Tricky stuff. It's so much to hold. It's so, I feel like I use the word nuance all the time, but that's just what keeps coming back to mind about. I also, to your point, Darla, love, just as you said, the power that Carrie claims with naming all of her identities, like how, that is just an incredibly powerful thing to do. And when I think about the power that exists within the disability community from our diversity, and how much power we could be claiming by actively, specifically naming all of the different groups of people who are part of our family. That feels like an incredible asset. All right, in the chat, Katrina shared, what struck me was her comment about putting power between one identity, this idea that you can only be part of the LGBTQ community or disability community, not both. It's interesting to think about. It is so true. I've I've been kicked out of a lot of autism mom Facebook groups for insisting on talking about race, which is interesting. Now it's a badge of honor, but it is interesting how many times I would have this conversation where like someone would be talking about an idea they have for a program or something, and I would say, that sounds amazing, and I'm curious how we can be intersectional about this and think about the impact this will have on Black children, for example. And I literally had someone say, we're here to talk about autism. We're not here to talk about race and social justice or whatever. So stop being divisive. And I thought, how is it divisive to say this part of your community would like your support? But that's a really common experience. It happened a lot in the feminist movement in the 60s on forward. The original, or I guess second wave feminist movement really centered the experience of white women. And in a lot of ways was about trying to achieve equality between white women and white men. A lot of it was about like wage equity, for example. That doesn't do a lot for the experience of women of color. That doesn't do a lot for the experience of immigrants who are working as domestic workers, who are the nannies and the housekeepers who are tending to and doing that domestic labor that makes it possible for someone to go out in the workplace and command this big salary. Those needs were not being centered. Those conversations were not being had. And there tends to be this, I don't know, I guess this gap where if I raise my hand and I say I have a racial justice concern, I might have people in the feminist community who say, well, over there, they're doing racial justice work, take it to them. And in the racial justice space, they might say, but that's a woman's thing, take it over there. And so where do I go, right? Just like Kimberly Crenshaw was saying with that lawsuit, if you're in the space where you're being harmed by two different kinds of oppression, and the combination of the two, it's not 1 + 1 = 2, it's like 1 + 1 = orange. It's this new thing, this magnified, very unique kind of harm that happens when those oppressions collide. And it can be very isolating and leave you with none of your needs being met because none of the communities that you're part of are tending to your needs as someone at the intersections. I was just checking the chat. I have one more video for you.
There is a chat says, I've heard.
Disability is a normal, positive part of human diversity.
There are 1 billion individuals in this world with disabilities.
There's a lot of kinds of different disabilities.
Disabled people have other important identities.
We want to have a say in everything that affects us.
We are people with disabilities building power and inclusive social justice movements.
You can't have racial justice or economic justice or gender justice without disability justice. Just like you can't have disability justice without having racial, economic, and gender justice. To actually achieve any of those things requires achieving all of those things.
When we evolve our institutions to be fully inclusive, we can build a world where all are free.
True inclusion is revolutionary.
What do you think? There's one sentence in particular that leaps out at me, but I want to wait and hear from other folks first. I see a heart. I see another heart. Those folks at the Ford Foundation are doing some really good work these days. I actually, do you know, the story of the Ford Foundation is really interesting. When Darren Walker is the CEO of the Ford Foundation. When he took over, he published this big, very assertive, very progressive plan about all the social justice work that he wanted to lead as part of the Ford Foundation. And disability was nowhere in the plan at all, just completely absent. And he got called out hard by Judy Heumann and Rebecca Coakley and all of our wonderful disability rights advocates and warriors, all saying, what the heck, dude, really? This is not okay. And what I love is that he listened and he wrote this really beautiful apology about what an aha moment that was for him and how much he learned from that experience. And now there's a dedicated fund at Ford, I think it's about $10 million per year that they award to disability rights organizations, just focused on doing really powerful disability rights work and shifting resources to the disability community. And I think that there's so much power in seeing that kind of experience of a big, powerful foundation like Ford coming out in favor of social justice, realizing that they missed the mark because they were held accountable by our people, by our community, and course correcting. It's a pretty powerful experience.
Adina, this is Darla. I really love the fact that, you know, this is what I would consider fully inclusive. So often it's like they want to divide people up, you know, and it's like, again, I always go back to my friend who said, I'm not raising an eyeball, right? I'm raising an entire person. Yes. And so how do we divide out certain characteristics of individuals and not be inclusive of the whole? And so that's what I love.
Yeah. I'm curious what you all think of the phrase. There was a sentence there toward the last third of the video where the speaker said, you can't have economic justice or gender justice or racial justice without disability justice. What does that mean to you? And vice versa, that we can't have disability justice if we don't have racial justice and gender justice and economic justice.
I can share. I guess my thoughts on that is really, it comes down to the type of person you are. And if you really care about people with disabilities, then you've got to show that same compassion across the board. So I think that's just so critical is, yeah, you need to be able to share that same kindness with everyone.
Absolutely.
This is Malia. So I'm engaged in the autism community more than anything. And I noticed that with Autism Acceptance Month, everyone is using the infinity loop with the rainbow colors. And I'm hoping that because they're putting that there, they're accepting that inclusiveness, being more inclusive. So, I mean, yeah, I just putting that symbol there doesn't mean that people are going to automatically change their shift, but it's something we can point to, like here's this community that is saying we need to embrace all of those things. And then, yeah, economics and disability go hand in hand so much. It just you have a person out of work that because they're caring for someone else, and yeah, or they've become disabled because of their economic status in the world, you know, diabetes and whatnot can cause you just have a higher chance of diabetes, which can cause disability. It all goes together.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other things that comes to mind is about how ableism is unique among forms of oppression because it's used to amplify other forms of oppression in ways that are really sneaky. And I think understanding the way those things fit together also sheds more light on that statement of we can't have racial justice without disability justice, and we can't have disability justice without gender justice, that they're all tied together. All forms of oppression are connected. So here are a couple examples of how ableism is used to amplify sexism and racism. Where's my note? So back in the, what century? 18th and 19th centuries, when enslaved people in the United States escaped from slavery, they would be diagnosed with a psychiatric condition called drapetomania. They would literally, like doctors would literally say to them, the reason that you tried to escape is because you're crazy. There's something wrong with you. And the purpose of that is there's multiple components to it, but a big one is to send the message to other enslaved people that this is a sign of illness, this is a sign of madness, this is a sign of disability for you to try to leave this institution of slavery. There's something wrong with you if you want that. Attaching that label of disability, that label particularly of psychiatric illness and psychiatric disability to a person is really leveraging the stigma that's attached to it so that they can keep their enslaved people enslaved a little bit longer. Similarly, when women were trying to get the right to vote, there were, I don't know, why does it always come back to medical providers? I like doctors. Doctors can be really great, but I guess like all institutions, we all have some messy parts of our history. There were providers, medical providers, back in the late 19th, early 20th century when women were trying to get the right to vote, who would argue that women were too psychologically fragile to have the responsibility of voting, that if they were to have the right to vote, they would be at increased risk of insanity. They would be diagnosed with hysteria and put in psychiatric institutions and completely disenfranchised. Again, so taking this mechanism of ableism and the ability to remove someone's rights through ableism and attaching it to something like sexism in the case of women trying to get the right to vote, or racism in the case of slavery. And it exists, it persists even to this day. We see examples of it. Even like in the 1960s, it was very common for Black activists and members of the Black Panthers to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. It wasn't that all Black Panthers are schizophrenic. It's a pretty rare psychological condition. It doesn't happen very often, but it's a convenient label to put on someone who is agitating the status quo and trying to be disruptive and trying to seek better rights for members of their community. And those attachments, I think over time, one of the things that's really tricky is that they start to become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where some stereotypes that are attached to certain diagnoses or stereotypes that are attached to certain groups of people, certain identities, they start getting really embedded and start getting tied to some of these ideas around like ableism, racism, and sexism. So, what comes up for you if we unpack that? I think one example that I think of, and we'll get into this a little bit more just in the next couple of minutes, about how I see racism and ableism tied together, is the rates of discipline for kids of color who are special education students and the kind of discipline that they're subjected to. It's usually being expelled and suspended. Or some of the narratives that we see sometimes around access to, in Seattle, they call them the highly capable cohort, or like it's like those advanced placement kinds of classes, where maybe a white child who's being disruptive in class, sometimes the narrative is they're just too smart and they're bored and that's why they're getting disruptive and they need more challenge. If a child of color is being disruptive in class, it's typically not the narrative that's attached or the way that it's explained. It's not they're too smart and they're bored and they need more challenge. It's often they have an attachment disorder or a conduct disorder, or it's pathologized in some way. Any other examples that come to mind?
Well, I'm not sure this is an example of that, but what comes to mind for me is the fact that for individuals with disabilities, we're always trying to help them become as non-disabled as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And if you took that to any other group to try and take away that identity of theirs, that's just, we don't say and celebrate them for the whole contributing person that they are as they show up. We're always trying to change them. And I find that very offensive.
Yeah, I think there might be a parallel though, that comes to mind. I was thinking about the way that people are expected to assimilate into dominant culture. And so if you're from a family of immigrants or you're from a culture that's not white, basically the United States, you have to do something that's called code switching, where at home, you might speak a different language, you might eat different food, you might wear different clothes, you might just your cultural behavior will be slightly different because that's what's normal for you. And then when you're in these quote unquote mainstream spaces, the expectation is that you will act like everybody else. I've seen, like, I know even my sister, gosh, she's in her mid 50s and still straightens her hair every day because she works in finance, and it's more acceptable for her to have straight hair than it is for her to wear her hair the way it grows out of her head. All of the choices that we make about the language that we use, the dialect that we speak, the clothes that we wear. I think there's a lot of ways that communities of color can point to those experiences of being asked to mask who they are in some way or assimilate in some way. And that could be such a great access point for us to understand each other more deeply. Any other thoughts rumbling around? There are no wrong answers. AGB practiced eugenics in deaf culture. I don't know what AGB is. Can you educate me, Brian? It's just a note from the chat. Okay. I think.
Looks like he's wondering if the interpreter can see him.
Mm-hmm.
Does he need to share his video?
Camera is on, the interpreter can't.
I could stop sharing my screen. That might help. Does that help?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, muted, sorry. Yeah. Sorry about that. It's a little feedback. Abgm, ableism, we're talking about is a practice that, for the deaf community. So like, means like deaf community joins with different groups of deaf and that are the same as them, and different little groups, and different values and things like that. Talking about the Alexander Graham Bell AGB, and process of the culture development and how they wanted to like put this kind of deaf there and that kind of deaf there. No, you kept them separate, and keep the deaf kind of under different groups. And like when the parents would meet, then the groups would grow, and the Alexander Graham Bell like prevented that. They wanted to change it so that the deaf group, the deaf groups stayed separate, and that was a practice a long time ago. And so our barrier to in the past, well now now we have like captioning access, and there's still barriers like that when there's not the captioning and access. You don't have an interpreter.
All right, that's really helpful. Thank you, Brian. I think that brings another level of nuance to how within our community of disability, whether it's based on identity or diagnosis or both, there are unique ways that we experience ableism and unique kinds of harm that we're exposed to because of it.
Yeah.
I like to use an intersectionality as kind of a magnifying glass. I feel like it helps me understand social issues that seem difficult to solve, probably because we don't fully understand the whole problem. There's a quote by Albert Einstein that a mentor of mine likes to use all the time. And he says, if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes understanding the problem and 5 minutes on the solution. And I think with a lot of our social justice issues, we tend to misunderstand the problem, and intersectionality can help us understand the problem better. An example that comes to mind is the school to prison pipeline. So we were just talking about like exclusionary discipline in schools and how kids of color with a special education designation might be treated differently than white children who are special education students. And usually when I hear people talk about the school to prison pipeline, I hear it discussed as a race issue. And it makes a lot of sense because Black youth are 14% of the youth in this country, and they're 45% of the kids in juvenile detention. And Native youth are like 6 times higher, or six times more likely than white children to be sent to juvenile detention. Latinx youth are more likely to be sent to juvenile detention. The numbers are staggering, and it looks like a race problem. And then you take a step back and you see the common theme through all of these children. 75% of the children in juvenile detention right now have a disability that qualifies for an IEP. So is it a racial justice problem or a disability justice problem? It's both, right? Because it's not just about special education, it's about which special education students, who within the realm of special education is getting the support that they need when they need it, and who is just being disciplined and kicked out into this punitive carceral system. So that's where intersectionality becomes a great tool for us to understand a problem better. The types of solutions that come to mind for that problem, if we think it's only about race, we have a very different set of potential solutions available to us if we think it's only about race rather than if we think it's only about disability, or if we think it's both. And that's usually the issue, is that it's both. Another example that comes to mind is environmental racism. So there are areas in this country where we've decided it's just okay to pollute the land and know that that's going to cause illness for a lot of people, and there's going to be higher rates of disability for a lot of people. And usually those areas are in communities of color. Flint, Michigan is a great example. It's a predominantly Black community. It's been 7, 8 years now that they have not yet had clean water. And we know what happens to children who grow up with lead contaminated water. We know that they are going to have impairments in the long term in terms of cognitive function and psychological function and risks of psychiatric illness. And yet we've not seen a lot of intervention to try to solve this problem. One of the reasons that rates of disability are higher in communities of color is because of issues like this one. There's an area in Louisiana called Cancer Alley. It's about 80 miles long. It's near where there are a lot of petrochemical plants in that area. Rates of cancer in Cancer Alley in Louisiana are 700 times higher than the national average. Do you think that they would build a Cancer Alley in the middle of a white neighborhood? Like, is that going to go in Ballard? I don't think that's going to happen in Ballard. I really don't. There's been some interesting research and lawsuits in the last few years about how when corporations do decide to pollute certain areas, the penalties are higher if they pollute in white communities as opposed to communities of color. So if you're a corporation and you're trying to decide what to do with chemical runoff and where you can afford to dump it, you go where the fees are lower, right? And that's where there are populations of people who are less privileged, less prioritized, less cared about, and less cared for. And that further enmeshes these tight relationships, I think, between disability and race. That's part of why we see such high rates of disability in communities of color. There was something I said earlier about how disability is both a cause and consequence of poverty. And I felt like we should unpack that a little bit. When I say that, what I mean is that if you are a person living in poverty, you're less likely to be able to access all kinds of things that you need to stay healthy. You're less likely to be able to access a safe living environment. You're less likely to access really nutritious food, proactive and preventative health care, all of these things that we need to stay well. And because you're less able to access those things, you're more likely to end up with the kinds of health conditions that can have long-term or just really intense short-term impacts that can lead to being disabled. If you're a disabled person, you're more likely to be living in poverty, right? Like, it's not like we have very robust systems in place in the United States to make sure that you have a lot of financial resources if you're a person with a disability. So you're more likely to, as a person with a disability, be living in a food desert, be living someplace where transit's hard to come by, have a difficult time getting access to really high quality healthcare, really nutritious food, great education, all of those types of investments that we make in ourselves to be well. And so it becomes this cycle. Darla, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing about the environmental settings. Are the fines cheaper in those settings because the individuals who live there have less ability to go after lawsuits and to sue the big companies? I mean, does that, in addition to race, really bring in that race and disability? It brings in classism and stuff. So
absolutely, I have some resources about that I can share after this. I'll share this slide deck as well as some resources for further learning. But that is absolutely true that class starts to play into it. I think the Sierra Club wrote an article 2 years ago about how we can't address climate change until we deal with white supremacy, which was quite a provocative thing for the Sierra Club to say. And their argument was pretty simple. It was that we have climate change because we have what we call sacrifice zones in the in the world. We have parts of the world where we're willing to sacrifice the well-being of the planet and the people who live there for the sake of capitalism. And usually those sacrifice zones are populated by people that we, as a whole global community, care about a little bit less, right? It's in the global South, or in the United States, it's Black communities, immigrant communities, Indigenous communities. Those are the areas that we see more environmental harm being perpetrated. And so if we were to tend to racism, eradicate racism and make it so it's not okay to harm any humans in that way, that would also require us to start grappling with what we're doing to the planet when we decide that there are some people that we just don't care about that much. Brenda, I see your hand.
There's a great question in the chat that I didn't want to have missed.
Thank you. Francis shares, what about parents who choose therapies for their family that are interpreted by others as ableism? ABA comes to mind. What we see as assistance is seen by others as ableism and not embracing their disability. Well, I'm really glad that you asked me such an easy question, Francis. That's a hard one. That is so, so, so hard. I honestly don't know the answer. I don't know that there is a straightforward answer. I really think the best thing that, as just answering that question as a parent, as a mom with 2 autistic kids, I have just always tried to follow the leadership of my children in terms of them indicating to me what they feel like they need to be working on so that they can feel safe and comfortable in their bodies. And they also get to work with us to figure out which providers are going to provide that service. But that's just a huge, very difficult debate with a lot of wisdom on both sides, and I don't know the answer to it.
Well, I think it just brings up I was going to say an argument, but that's not maybe the best word, but opportunity for some discussion or debate about, or at least in this space, an acknowledgement of the differences of, the medical model versus the, in my opinion, the human model, but just fixing and changing and improving, in quotes, the person that might have a developmental disability, as opposed to accepting where they are and where they want to be. So, but yes, there's a lot of differences in that subject.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a tough one. And I imagine to our intersectionality conversation, there's probably layers there as well with the cultural identity of families and whether or not they want ABA and what they're hoping to get out of ABA. I imagine that's also a very individualized conversation, depending on everyone's context. That's part of why it's so hard for me to answer it, because context is so different from one family and one community to another. For example, just the goals might be different in terms of, and the concerns for safety might be different. I remember when my son got his autism diagnosis, I got a big packet of materials from Seattle Children's. It had a lot of stuff from Autism Speaks, and a lot of it was about elopement and how likely it was that elopement would be part of our lives and something to worry about, and strategies for dealing with it. And one of the strategies that they endorsed very strongly was having a close relationship with the police and taking your child to police stations on a regular basis. And I gotta say, as a Black person, I don't always feel very safe around police. And it felt like when I read that information, like they weren't talking to me. I didn't think that I was their target audience. When the indication is one of like, what if, I didn't feel like there was any information about like, what if you don't feel like that's a group of people that you can plan to be safe around? Or what if there might be barriers in your way to feeling like it's okay to just walk into the mobile police station with your kid? There are a lot of reasons why someone might not feel comfortable doing that. Also, folks who are undocumented might not feel comfortable doing that either. So it just felt like an erasure. It felt like just not being seen and my cultural context not being considered. And I don't think it's that autism is very rare in communities of color at all. I don't think it's any more rare in communities of color than it is in white communities, but the resources that had been developed at that time were mostly centered for white families. And so you're just left on your own to try to figure it out. And that's really hard. That actually gets me to the next thing I wanted to share with you. So I'm going to share my screen again. I'm actually really glad we needed to stop sharing the screen because I got to see your faces for a while. So one of the things that I've been talking about a lot lately, because I don't know, I go on these kicks. You know how when you're feeling stressed out and you're just kind of feeling overwhelmed and you start hearing messages from folks about you just need more self-care. Just do more self-care. I've been thinking about care a lot, especially as it relates to our community, because I really feel like at the heart of all of the challenges that we encounter as people who either have disabilities or love people with disabilities is just the truth of not getting the care that we need when and how we need it, and how much strain that it causes to be in a space of not getting the care that you need when and how you need it. And I think that that can also be one of the biggest barriers to being as inclusive inside our community as we ask others outside of our community to be. I've been bumping into this for many years, this challenge of, it really feels like folks would say something along the lines of, it's so hard to get people to care about disability in the first place. I'm not going to make it harder by asking them to care about race on top of it. Like, I can't do that. We're just going to take what we can get. I hear that a lot. I call it trickle down social justice, and it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. We can't give social justice to the most privileged group of people in a community and think that it will somehow magically get to the folks that are at the bottom. that's not effective. We have to do it the other direction. We have to center the margins of the margins of the margins, the people who are in those gaps in between, because if it's not working for them, then it's not working. We can't declare success. And one of the ways that shows up for me is when I start thinking about this concept of care and those gaps in care that we notice that we're not getting, and how it makes it really hard for us to show up for each other because we're having to work so hard to fill in the gaps. So if care for me comes in 4 levels, this is a framework created by Deanna Zant, who works at Race Forward. And she describes it as like level 1 is self-soothing, level 2 is self-care, level 3 is community care, and level 4 is structural care. So self-soothing is the stuff that you do just to feel a little bit better when things are kind of lousy, right? So it's binge watching Netflix, going for a pedicure, taking a bubble bath, going for a nice walk, those things that we do that are just soothing activities for ourselves. I think that like societally, when we talk about self-care, usually it's actually self-soothing activities that we hear people talk about. It's why don't you take another bubble bath? Why don't you go out with your girlfriends? Why don't you go see a movie? Those are soothing actions, but they don't tend to really do much to shift your long-term situation. They just help you feel a little bit better. And that's great. I love to binge watch Netflix. That is a very, very relaxing activity for me. And I just try to right size it and make sure that I'm not expecting too much out of it. The next level is self-care. And those are those things that are really, I think of as like investments in myself, things that future me is going to thank present me for. So going to therapy, taking your meds, exercise, setting boundaries and actually enforcing them. That's a hard one. Protecting your sleep, getting some good exercise. And these are all very individual. So the things that might be self-care for me might be self-soothing for you and vice versa, right? Like it's just something that we all have to decide on our own. These are just examples to get us going. This is what I really want to zero in on is community care, because I think this is the part where we as a community of people who are disabled or who love disabled people have some room for growth. This is where I think we need to start getting really curious about each other and really curious about what community care could look like and what it needs to feel like and how it needs to be organized so that it's really felt by everyone in this giant tent that we call the disability community. So community care in a lot of ways is workarounds for things that we wish the government was providing for us, but that for whatever reason, it either can't or won't. So like universal basic, I guess not universal basic income. We'll get there next. Co-housing, ride shares, but it can also be fun stuff like block parties or like house sitting for your neighbor. It's those things that we do to take care of each other within our community. That's really the simplest way to put it. And what we often see in a community as big and diverse as ours is that community care is happening in these little buckets defined by other parts of our identity. It's not happening across difference as much as we might like to see. So community care within the subgroup of autism, and even further down, like needing like specific community organizations for families who need language access or families of color or autistic girls. Like we get really, really granular, setting up these very specific forms of community care based on these identities. And I'm wondering if we can start to be more inclusive with our community care and get really curious about each other in that way and learn what our needs are so that we can be showing up for each other more fully. And the reason we have to work so hard for community care is that we don't have as much structural care as we need. Structural care is the stuff like universal basic income. It's the stuff like paid family leave. It's not just a living wage, a thriving wage. It's universal childcare and elder care and clean water and safe streets and comprehensive health care and good public transportation. It's all of those big structural things that we typically can't create on our own. And the lack of structural care means we have to work a lot harder to compensate with community care and self-care. And that means we're tired. And when we get really tired and really depleted, it gets really hard to show up for each other, especially across difference, because it takes a lot of energy. And I think it's important to name that, because we can't work on it until we talk about it. It's a tricky, complicated thing. So before I go on, any insights or reflections here about these kind of thinking about care in levels?
I don't know, for me, the self-soothing slide was like a light bulb moment. I've never thought about that being separate than self-care. So that was great.
Awesome. I was noticing when I was naming the self-care items, I was like, oh, these are all things that I never actually want to do in the moment, but then I'm glad that I did it later. Like, do I have to exercise? But I know that after I'll feel better, but it can be hard.
Well, and what jumps out for me is the structural care, and how if we could work on fixing the structural care, the rest of it would be easier.
Yes. And I think here's the secret. The thing that could be so powerful about getting really curious about each other with our community care is that we start to notice all of these incredibly clever ways that our community members are compensating for the lack of structural care, right? And that helps us figure out what kind of structural care we really need. Because if we're not operating from that place of community, if we're not learning about each other and learning where the gaps are, then as we keep advocating for better structural care, we might advocate for an incomplete picture. We might come up with ideas that are good, but they don't get us all the way there, because we've been stuck in our silo because we're depleted. And so that's, I think, the big challenge is how do we, knowing that we're all operating from a place of depletion and how we are way over capacity, we left capacity a long time ago. How do we still create some systems to help us get curious about each other in our community, learn some more about each other in our community, so that we can be building some better structural care as a whole collective? So I think the truth is that a society where everybody belongs requires that we are all cared for in the ways that we need. That's it. And I think a lot of us want belonging, and that's going to require that we're all cared for. And we can't do that in silos. It just doesn't work. So we have to get curious. And getting curious is magical because it interrupts othering. So when you think about structural care, like the types of structural care that do exist, which groups of folks in our community of disability are furthest from structural care or have the hardest time accessing it? We all have a hard time accessing it. We'll just name that truth already, that there's not enough to go around.
People who don't use words for language.
Yes. That's a huge one.
And the question is specifically about the disability community.
Yes.
I mean, I guess I'm just thinking of all the other, someone in the disability community who has any of those other on that graphic.
Yeah.
You know, like they're located. I live in a rural area, and so you know, someone with a disability who doesn't have a car, who lives 15 miles from even a small town, and whose phone is broken.
Right. Absolutely.
And we in the rural communities sometimes don't have access to good internet.
Yes, that.
And then I have had several clients that were elderly, and that that puts a bigger strain, because then there's loneliness,
right?
Lack of access to other people to care about you.
Absolutely. I think about things like single parenthood. And so because you just have less time, it's such a time rich type of work to be a single parent caregiver, and how it's hard to access structural care because you don't have the time to fill out the forms and stand in the lines and be on the phone calls. Language access is a big one, whether that's language access because a person doesn't use words to communicate, or language access because of language of origin.
Cognitive abilities as well.
That's a huge one. People who fall between the gaps too, people who aren't disabled enough or old enough or anything else enough to receive structured assistance. Oh my God, yes, absolutely. It feels like a lot of assumptions of like someone else is going to tend to that person, but who?
People with smaller families.
Absolutely.
Who don't have the involved aunts and uncles and grandparents or siblings.
Yes. So with our last 20 minutes, I'm going to do a little neuroscience stuff. So you can, my inner nerd wants to come out and play. This is from, they used to be called the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. Now it's the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, which was directed by a guy named John Powell. And I was just talking about othering and how when we get curious about people, we can interrupt othering. And that's really important because othering suspends care. When we other people, it's a lot easier to stop caring about them. And there are lots of ways that we're socialized into doing that, where there are lots of messages that we've been getting our entire lives about who we should prioritize, who we should care about, and who we shouldn't. And a lot of that is happening below our level of consciousness. Most of those decisions are being made without us even really being aware of it, which is why we have to find some tools to use to interrupt those scripts. Because if we're socialized to only tend to people who have similar experiences to our own, so like only tend to, I don't know, veteran families, because my dad's an Army vet, or if I'm just looking out for other families who experience autism, and I'm othering other forms of disability because I'm like, it's not my area, that act of othering makes it a lot easier for me to suspend care. It makes it a lot harder for me to really offer the community care that we were talking about that we all need so much. And a lot of that othering does tend to happen along lines of bias. Like I think implicit bias is a term that we hear a lot. And implicit bias shows up in lots of different ways. It can show up, you can have a bias about anything, honestly. We can have bias about skin tone as well as skin color, so how light or dark a person is. We can have bias about the size of a person's body. We can have bias about race. We can have bias about religion. We can have bias about language, about our perception of someone's accent. We can go on and on and on. Those are all ways that we can start to other people. And in a community as diverse as ours, it's important to be really aware of the fact that that bias can exist so that we can develop some plans to deal with it and interrupt it. So this is, I told you I was nerdy. This is from Susan Fisk, who is a really brilliant sociologist at Rutgers. And she created this, this model to help us understand how stereotypes work. And the gist of it is this. She breaks people down into 4 big categories. And our brains react differently depending on where a person falls in these categories. So in the group of people where we have a sense of high admiration and high status, and we don't really feel competitive toward them, we think that they're really competent at what they do, and we have a lot of respect for them. That would be like Olympic athletes. So you put somebody in an MRI machine and you show them a picture of an Olympic athlete, and the parts of their brain that light up are the parts that are associated with the sense of warmth and the sense of pride even. And then there are different groups of people that go in different sections. There might be people where we think they're really competent, but we don't feel very warm toward them. There might be people where we think we feel really warm toward them, but we don't think of them as very competent. Elders fall into that category for a lot of people. That's a stereotype people have. Feel very warm toward grandma, but don't think she's really good with computers. And then this bottom left corner, this is the really hard part. This is the spot where we treat people with contempt or disgust. That's where we don't feel warm at all, and we don't think people are competent. The category of person that she found in her testing that we humans tend to put in that category would be a person who is unhoused, a homeless person. And there's this interesting thing that happens with our brains. If you put any one of us in a functional MRI machine and show a picture of a person, your brain will just light up with recognition. It's this evolutionary trick that we developed over many thousands of years, recognizing another person. That doesn't happen if you see a person who you put in this contempt, disgust, disregard category. So if you're at the functional MRI machine and they show you a picture of a person who looks homeless, your brain doesn't recognize them as human. If you're socialized in the United States with this value system that we have, our brain just doesn't light up the same way. But there's a magic trick that I think is just fascinating. And it's this simple. Person's in the machine, they show them a picture of the person who's panhandling and is unhoused. Their brain is like not recognizing that person as a person. And then they ask, what kind of vegetables do you think that person likes? And all of a sudden, brain lights up like Vegas. All of a sudden, it's just that getting curious, that act of curiosity of, oh, you're a person. I'm interested in you. And I think that there's a lot of power there in starting to think about what kinds of questions could we be asking ourselves when we notice ourselves othering someone to try to interrupt it. What kinds of questions could we be asking ourselves, even when we're just in a place of noticing, hey, I don't have a lot of people in my network who look like this, or I don't have a lot of people in my church community. It's pretty homogenous. It looks this way. What kinds of questions could I ask myself about a person who I think of as an outsider so that I can get curious about them and start to care more deeply, right? Because othering suspends care, and getting curious suspends othering. Pretty wild. What do you think?
The chat says this is absolutely heartbreaking, and I felt the same way. If, you know, at a basic level, my brain didn't even recognize a person who's unhoused as being a person. I mean, that's ridiculously sad. But as well as I love the idea of suspending that othering quite easily as thinking about a vegetable.
Yeah. Incarcerated people are another group that we've been socialized to disregard or to treat with that kind of disgust. And pausing to ask a question like, I wonder what their favorite book is. Or I wonder what kind of birthday cake they like. It's very humanizing.
It's nice to know a trick that you can question, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And try to turn your brain around.
Absolutely. Because I gotta say, there's a lot of othering that I've observed that usually comes from scarcity. It usually comes from a place of, I'm overwhelmed, I don't have a lot of resources, I can't care about everybody, I have to draw lines somewhere. I actually used to work for a very beloved nonprofit that serves kids with disabilities. And I was advocating for making a concerted effort to hire more people of color on staff, and was told by the board president, diversity is nice to have, but it's not our mission. It's just, I can't give resources to that. I can't think about that. Like, right, but our mission is to serve people with disabilities, and people with disabilities look a lot of different ways. So maybe that is our mission, right? But it was absolutely, I don't think there's any malice there. I think it really came from this place of, I don't have capacity. But that also felt like othering. It felt like that's them. That's a race issue, or that's a gender issue, or that's a something over there. And I don't have space for that right now. And I wonder, if having information like this at that time, if I could have asked some questions to kind of interrupt that othering, kind of get to that place of being more curious. And there's something about the word curious that I think of as being a little bit more playful, even like there's a lightness to it that can also be really helpful in getting past that place of othering and really humanizing each other.
Adana, when I was new in the field, I remember talking to some senators about why don't we take the silos down in DSHS? You know, why are we trying to, break people apart, right?
Yeah.
And I was told flat out by a senator that you don't want to do that, and you don't want to say that because you'll never be able to advocate for what's important to you. But I think in society, what needs to be important to all of us is everyone, right? And how do we advocate for true inclusion of all human beings, to make sure all human beings have those community needs that they need? And always looking at tracing back to where the dollar comes from and what the dollar's driving, and looking at, okay, the dollar's driving division. How do we overcome that to get back to equalism and I guess not back to, but get to equalism and full inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's like I understand how someone could get to that place of giving that advice about it being hard to advocate for what's important to you, but also what kind of sacrifices are you making in terms of coalition building? And I think there's also just a moral issue at stake of, if we're going to claim people as members of our community, for example, if we're going to claim all 61 million adults with disabilities as part of our community, knowing that some of them are women and some of them are trans and some of them are Black and some of them are Indigenous and some of them are elders and some of them, like, we could go on and on, then we have a responsibility to actually represent them fully and show up for each other if we're going to claim them for the sake of numbers.
Exactly. And regardless of color of skin or ability or level of mental health or gender identity or age, they need to be able to have access to what they need to be treated fully and welcoming as part of the community, and have the same privilege as everyone else.
Yes. Thank you, Darla. I think that's a great segue into the last thing that I wanted to talk about today with our final 10 minutes. I don't know how that went by so fast. So I've got a private question that I think is a good one about like playing devil's advocate for a moment. The thought of advocating for everyone is daunting, and it is easier to focus on silos. So how do we be effective and pragmatic in focusing on everyone, but also knowing that we can only be focused on so many things at a time? That is a great question and a really important one. I'm glad that you asked it. I think a lot about the curb cut effect in moments like these. So the curb cut effect, you probably already know about this, is the idea that when we put curb cuts on sidewalks, we did it because we wanted sidewalks to be more accessible for wheelchair users. And by making the sidewalk more accessible for wheelchair users, we figured out the sidewalk just got a lot more accessible for people pushing strollers and people walking with a cane and people with a dolly full of packages. And like, you could go on and on and on. There's something about centering the margins that tends to produce universal results. So an example of this comes from the 1960s. There was a Black womanist collective called the Combahee River Collective. They were kind of like existing in answer to white feminism because they felt excluded by white feminism. And they talked a lot about They didn't use the same language yet. I think they're like the grandmothers of this language. They talked a lot about the power of finding the most marginalized person you can and figuring out what liberation looks like for them. Because on the way to taking care of their needs, you have to take care of everything else. So if I want disability justice and I want to be the most effective at it, it would really serve me to look for, I don't know, the Black, trans, immigrant, disabled, nonverbal person living in poverty, non-English speaker. Like that person exists, right? It serves me to find that person. And if I can't make the system work for them, then the system doesn't work. Because whatever accommodations I make to make it work for them are probably going to work for everybody else. I thought about that a lot with COVID and the transition to online learning and how much work school districts were doing, trying to scramble and figure out how to do special education services online. And I was so frustrated because I thought if you'd started with the special education services instead of starting with gen ed and then trying to figure out how to make special ed fit into it, this would be so much easier. You wouldn't be reverse engineering so much. Like you wouldn't be suddenly having to figure out how to make text readers work on Google Meet versus Teams. Like you would have, if you'd started with the text readers, everything else would work too. So that's my answer is it is daunting to focus on everybody. And I think the way we focus on everybody is by getting super specific about finding that example of someone who's incredibly marginalized and trying to figure out how to make it work for them and then universalizing those solutions. Which leads me to the last little bit, which is disability justice as a framework versus disability rights. Disability rights, like we know a lot about the disability rights movement. We know about the Capitol Crawl. We know about the ADA, just extraordinary activism and really powerful work that was done on behalf of our community. And it's work that I think of as the floor, not the ceiling, right? It's not done yet. It's not complete. And disability justice was or is a movement that's been developed by marginalized folks within the community of disability to try to make our activism work even more accessible and intersectional and make sure it's really tending to the needs of all of us. And it's very positive in its orientation. So this latest issue, the spring issue of Nonprofit Quarterly, because I'm a nerdy person who reads Nonprofit Quarterly, is all about what it could look like for the nonprofit sector to be pro-Black, not just anti-racist, but pro-Black. And I think a lot about that from a disability perspective. What does it look like to be pro-disability, not just anti-ableism? How's that different? How does it feel different even? And I think disability justice has a lot of great language to help kind of orient ourselves that way. So there's this quote who's from Patty Byrne, who's one of the founders of the movement, who says that all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together with nobody left behind. This is disability justice. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. It feels like a recurring theme. And there are 10 core principles. The first is intersectionality, which we've been talking about all day. The next is leadership of the most impacted. The third is anti-capitalist politic. Fourth is cross-movement organizing, which I think we were just talking about too. 5 is recognizing wholeness. 6 is sustainability. 7 is cross-disability solidarity. We talked about that a little bit early on. 8 is interdependence, because independence is a lie. Frankly, it's a myth. Like we all depend on other people. It's just a question of what it looks like. 9 is collective access, and 10 is collective liberation. Leadership of the most impacted is really all about like, we follow the wisdom of the people most impacted by these systems. That's really it. The people who are at the margins, who are getting squished, who have these interactions that can be so challenging, they know the systems really well. They know where the gaps are, and they can be really powerful leaders for us. And anti-capitalist politic, that's all about challenging assumptions about what productivity means and challenging ideas about conformity and the value of it. cross-movement organizing, I think about things like voting rights are under attack again, goodness sakes. And in Georgia, they passed some really strange laws recently that they're making it harder to vote, but they're also making it illegal to give water to people who are waiting in line to vote. If that isn't a disability rights issue and a disability access issue, as much as it is a racial justice issue, I don't know what is, right? Like that's absolutely about attacking disabled folks, like to make it harder for us to be able to access our civic duty as voters. It's really appalling. And the framing of the conversation nationally is often about race, but there's a very natural, I think, access point to be talking about how that's also a disability justice issue. Recognizing wholeness, that's the idea that none of us need to be fixed. We're not broken. We don't need to be fixed. Sustainability is so hard to do. That's another kind of pushback against capitalism, right? That's thinking about pace and thinking about capacity and thinking about being in it for the long haul, thinking about designing our activism to be done in a way where when we get to the promised land, when we get to liberation, we actually have the energy to enjoy it. We haven't burned ourselves out by the time we get there. Cross-disability solidarity, I think that gets what Brenda was sharing earlier about that sense of even within our community, to a degree, there being silos and hierarchy, where there's some othering that happens based on diagnosis or based on like the way that we're categorized, and how we could be so much more powerful and just care for each other so much more deeply if we can try to push against that structure. Interdependence, I think that's also all about that community care stuff we were talking about. Like, how can we, knowing that we're all depleted, knowing that we're all overwhelmed, how can we be leaning on each other so that we can increase our collective capacity so we don't have to do as much on our own? And then collective access and collective liberation, I think, really go hand in hand. Basically, that like collective access I see as an invitation to get really curious about how we can work together to share space in a way that works for everyone, because that's so crucial to us being able to do this kind of work. And collective liberation is that we don't want to leave anyone behind, that we can't declare victory. We can't say that we've gotten to a place where all of our needs are met unless really all of our needs are met. It can't just be like we managed to get our needs met for, I don't know, English speakers over the age of 50. Like that's not success. That's a step. We're moving in the right direction, but we're not done. We really want to have a very holistic definition of what it means to be complete. Insights, thoughts, reflections. How does disability justice feel different? Darla says it feels more inclusive. Yeah. I think of it as very strengths-based too. Trish says it feels like something that we want, not just what we want to avoid. Yes. Yeah, that positive orientation is my favorite thing. I love that. And I think that some of the intention behind some of the North Star work that the DDC has been doing was to start asking those questions about what would it look like to thrive? What if we were putting our wants and our desires at the center of our wish list instead of just what we think we can get or what we think someone might say yes to? Disability rights are about being tolerated, and disability justice is about being welcomed. Yes. I think one of the big challenges with disability rights is that it assumes that you have access to the law, that the law is going to work for you. So like the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, if I want to access the protection of the ADA, I have to hire a lawyer. I have to sue somebody. That's hard work. That means I have to know that that's an option. I have to have the resources to do it. That's a really heavy lift. There's a lot of burden that's involved there. That actually gets me thinking about this concept I've been studying lately that's called administrative burden. Some of you might have heard me talk about this before. And it's the idea that when we have interactions with the government, there are some costs involved that we bear as individuals that the government doesn't take into account usually. And they are learning costs, psychological costs, and compliance costs. So to use the ADA as an example, if I want to be protected by the ADA, like the law's there, that's great. They did it. They did some really important work there. And then there's some more work that I have to do. And that's hard work. There's the learning cost. I have to learn what the ADA is. I have to learn how it works, whether or not it applies to me, how to access it, all that stuff. That's a lot of work. And then there's the psychological cost. I have to deal with any associated stigma that might come with needing support from the ADA. I might have to deal with some psychological cost in terms of knowing that I'm dependent on the government for that protection, and I feel maybe a loss of autonomy. Nobody else can do that for me, right? That's something I have to do myself. And then the third one is compliance cost. There's like all the paperwork to fill out. There's all of the documentation that you need. As a person with a disability who's in graduate school at Seattle University, every quarter I have to go back to the Disability Services Office with a letter from my doctor that says, yes, Adana is still disabled. Yes, she still needs these accommodations. This hasn't gone anywhere. And then I have to take that letter after the Disability Services signs off on it to whatever professors I have that quarter and negotiate what the accommodations are going to look like in their classes for the quarter every 3 months. It's a lot. That's a huge amount of work. I think about that burden as something that our community faces constantly with. There are the rights that we have. There are the services that we're entitled to. There are the programs that exist. Those are all really important. And we need support figuring out how to tend to the weight of those other burdens, those in-between spaces. And I think that's where community care comes in. That's all I have. But I would love to just discuss and answer questions if there are any. I'll be sure to share my slides and some resources with Darla and Brenda to forward to you all.
I just, this is Darla, and sorry I can't turn my camera on for some reason, but I just want to thank you, Adana. This was just absolutely amazing. And I want to let everyone know that we're going to have a follow-up conversation. I believe it's on, Brenda, is it May 25th or May 25th at 6 p.m. in the evening? And we will send out a Zoom link for that. So anyone who would like to continue this conversation with Adana, we're going to continue from there as well. I so appreciate you all being with us today and being patient with our technology struggles at the beginning.
Thank you so much.